There is a version of this story that Charles Hargrove III told his attorneys the morning after it happened, and there is the version that actually happened. In his version, a sophisticated criminal operation exploited a gap in his building's security infrastructure during a narrow window created by a scheduled IT audit. In the actual version, the gentleman walked into the most protected private office in Midtown Manhattan on a Friday night at midnight, retrieved a file that had been locked inside for 14 months, left a single chess piece on the desk, and was home before the night security supervisor finished his 12:15 a.m. rounds. The cameras recorded everything. The recordings showed nothing useful. Hargrove's security team spent 9 days reviewing footage and produced a 40-page report that described, in exhaustive detail, everything that hadn't happened. The file contained 11 documents. Together, they proved that Hargrove Capital's legal team had restructured a senior analyst's severance agreement 17 days before a profit-sharing event that would have paid that analyst $4,300,000. The restructuring was legal. The timing was not accidental. The analyst's name was Ray Okafor, and he had spent 11 years building the quantitative model that generated the fund's best 3-year run in its history. When the run ended, not because the model failed, but because the market rotated away from the conditions it was designed for, Hargrove had Ray walked out of the building on a Tuesday morning with a cardboard box, a non-disparagement agreement, and a severance package that contained on page 184 of a 200-page document a clause that retroactively restructured his profit-sharing eligibility. Ray signed it because he had a mortgage in Flushing and a daughter starting college in the fall, and because the attorney Hargrove's HR team recommended for the review process had, it would later become clear, a financial relationship with a firm that did regular work for Hargrove Capital. None of that was illegal either. That's the thing about Charles Hargrove. He had spent 30 years building a fortress not out of walls but out of paperwork. Every move he made was reviewed by attorneys who billed $1,200 an hour and whose entire professional value was in making unconscionable things unassailable. He had never lost a lawsuit. He had never been sanctioned by the SEC. He had been profiled in Forbes twice, once under the headline "The Last Honest Broker on Wall Street," a line he had not written but had not corrected. He was the kind of man who had won so many games that he had genuinely begun to believe the winning was a function of his character rather than his position. That belief was his only real vulnerability, and it took a handwritten letter on cream-colored stationery to reveal it. If someone told you right now that they were going to walk into the most secure private office in your city on a specific date at a specific time and retrieve something that had been locked inside for over a year, would you call the police? Or would you laugh? Take a moment with that question. It's more important than it sounds. If you're finding this channel for the first time, The Gentleman's Game is where stories like this one live. Stories about what happens when intelligence is applied with patience, precision, and a code that doesn't bend. Hit subscribe if that's the kind of story you want in your life. The question at the end of this one is going to stay with you. The letter arrived on a Monday. Hargrove's assistant, a woman named Patricia, who had worked for him for 12 years and who had developed an almost clinical ability to assess his moods from the way he walked off the elevator, brought it in with the morning briefing stack. It was on the bottom, which was where she put things she had already decided were not urgent. The envelope had no return address. The handwriting was precise and unhurried. The kind of handwriting that belongs to someone who learned it as a discipline rather than a convenience. Hargrove read it twice, set it down, and then picked it up again and read it a third time. The letter said, "On Friday evening at midnight, I will enter your office and retrieve the documentation relating to the restructuring of Raymond Okafor's severance agreement, dated March 14th of last year. I am telling you this not because I expect you to allow it, but because a warning is owed. You may do with this information whatever you choose. There was no signature. There was no threat. There was nothing that could be reported to law enforcement as a credible statement of criminal intent. Hargrove's general counsel, a man named Jeffrey Wallace, who had survived 4 administrations at the firm by being constitutionally incapable of alarm, confirmed this within the hour. Someone is either testing you or playing a very strange game, Wallace said. Either way, the appropriate response is to ignore it. Hargrove did not ignore it. This was the first move the gentleman had counted on. Charles Hargrove III was not a man who ignored things. He was a man who responded to challenges the way a certain kind of powerful person always responds, by escalating in ways that felt like control and functioned as exposure. By Tuesday morning, he had called the building's head of security, a former NYPD detective named Lou Santini, who ran a tight operation and who was, by any honest assessment, very good at his job. By Wednesday, he had approved a $200,000 emergency security enhancement package that included 2 additional camera installations in the hallway outside his office, upgraded biometric readers on the 41st floor entry points, a third-party cybersecurity firm contracted to monitor all digital access logs on the relevant Friday night, and an additional overnight security guard stationed specifically on his floor. By Thursday, he had told the story at dinner to 3 people, a habit he had of narrating his own competence in real time, and all 3 of them had found it amusing. The general consensus at that dinner table was that whoever sent the letter was either a crank or someone with a very poor understanding of how modern corporate security worked. On Friday morning, Hargrove walked through the 41st floor himself and reviewed every position. He stood in the hallway outside his office and looked at the new cameras. He tested the biometric reader. He spoke with Santini for 20 minutes about sight lines and response times. He went home to his apartment on Central Park West at 7:30, ate dinner, and told his wife that someone had tried to rattle him this week and hadn't come close. His wife, who had been married to him for 26 years, and who had long since learned to hear the particular register of his confidence that meant he was not as certain as he sounded, said nothing. Hargrove was asleep by 10:30. His office was not. To understand what happened on that floor between 11 p.m. and 12:30 a.m., you have to understand the specific shape of the world that Hargrove had built around himself. The 41st floor of 1251 6th Avenue housed only Hargrove's personal office, his private conference room, and the office of his chief of staff, a position currently vacant after his last chief of staff had left, under circumstances that the non-disparagement agreement she signed prevented her from describing publicly. The floor was accessible by elevator only with a valid biometric credential registered to Hargrove Capital, or by stairwell with a physical keycard that cycled on a 72-hour reset schedule. The cameras, 6 of them now, with the 2 new installations, covered every angle of the hallway and both entry points. The guard Hargrove had stationed there, a man named Gary, who worked for Santini's firm and who had done this job for 9 years without incident, was positioned at the elevator bank with a direct line to the building's main security desk on the lobby level. The third-party cybersecurity firm, a boutique outfit called Meridian Security Solutions that Hargrove's IT director had sourced on short notice, had stationed one of their contractors on the floor as well, with a laptop connected to a real-time monitoring dashboard that tracked every digital credential access event in the building. His name was listed in the contract as D. Reyes, and he had arrived at 10:15 p.m. with a Meridian badge, a laptop bag, and a coffee from the deli on 51st Street, and Gary had waved him through because Gary had been told to expect a contractor, and because D. Reyes had a Meridian badge and a work order on Meridian letterhead, and a manner that suggested he had done this kind of thing many times and found it mildly tedious, which is exactly how someone doing legitimate overnight IT work would seem. There are questions you stop asking about people when their presence has already been explained to you. This is not a failure of intelligence. It is how attention works. We allocate it toward the uncertain and away from the resolved. Gary's attention that night was directed toward the elevator and the stairwell door, because those were the entry points the letter had implied would be used. It was not directed toward the man already inside the perimeter, sitting at a folding table near the conference room with a laptop and a coffee, monitoring a dashboard that Gary couldn't read from where he was standing, and had no reason to interrogate. At no point during the 9 days of footage review that followed did Hargrove's security team identify a meaningful discrepancy in what D. Reyes did between 10:15 and 12:45 a.m. The cameras showed him at his table. They showed him walking to the restroom twice. They showed him speaking briefly with Gary at 11:50, a conversation that Gary later described as being about nothing. About whether there was a Dunkin' nearby, about whether the building's Wi-Fi was always this slow. What the cameras could not show, because there was no camera position to show it, was the interior of Hargrove's office, a room that Hargrove himself had kept camera-free as a matter of personal policy, a policy his attorneys had suggested years ago, and that he had maintained because the alternative, putting a camera inside his own office, had struck him as a form of surveillance directed at himself that he was unwilling to tolerate. The file was in a locked cabinet behind Hargrove's desk. The cabinet required a physical key. The key was on a ring in Hargrove's desk drawer, which was itself locked, and that lock required a key that Hargrove kept on his person. In the weeks after, when Hargrove tried to explain to his attorneys how both locks had been opened without any sign of forced entry, the answer he kept arriving at was that it wasn't possible. The locks were intact. The drawer was intact. The cabinet was intact. The only thing that was different was the file, which was gone, and the chess piece, which was there. By this point, are you still trying to figure out how he did it, or have you settled into the feeling that you're watching something that simply happened? The way impossible things sometimes simply happen when someone has thought about them long enough and carefully enough? That's the right feeling. Stay with it. Meridian Security Solutions was a real company. It had a website, a LinkedIn presence, 3 verified client testimonials, and a suite of business registration documents filed in Delaware. It had existed for 14 months. Its only contractor of record was a man whose professional history, if you pulled it, was exactly what you'd expect from someone who did overnight IT security work: credible, unremarkable, and assembled from the kind of institutional sources that a rushed background check would confirm and a thorough one would eventually find interesting. The contract with Hargrove Capital had been routed through the IT director, a man named Douglas Park, who had been given very little time and a very specific set of requirements by a very angry managing partner, and who had done what any reasonable person in his position would do. He had found a firm that could meet the requirements, confirm their credentials, and sign the paperwork. Nobody at Hargrove Capital had asked why Meridian had reached out to them directly 2 days before the contract was signed, with a proposal that addressed every specific security concern Hargrove had described in the internal meeting where he'd outlined his response to the letter. Nobody had asked because the timing felt like good fortune rather than architecture. That is the difference between paranoia and pattern recognition, and Hargrove had spent 30 years cultivating the former in his adversaries and the latter in himself. He had simply not considered that someone might apply it to him. The chess set had been in Hargrove's office for 22 years. It was a Staunton set in rosewood and maple, given to him by his father on the occasion of his making partner at his first firm, with a note that said, in his father's handwriting, "The game is won before the first move." Hargrove kept it on the credenza behind his desk, fully arranged, never played. It was the kind of object that exists in powerful men's offices as a symbol rather than an instrument, a declaration of a self-image. He had looked at that set so many times from so many angles in so many moods that its presence had become a form of furniture. He no longer saw it. He saw through it. The queen was from the dark set. Rosewood, hand-turned, the tallest piece on the board. When Hargrove walked into his office at 7:15 on Saturday morning, having received a call from Santini at 6:50 that something needed to be discussed in person, the first thing he saw was the empty file cabinet, door standing open, drawer standing open, everything intact except for the absence of what had been inside. The second thing he saw was the folder on his desk, empty, placed precisely in the center of his blotter. The third thing he saw, placed on top of the folder, was the chess piece. He stood in the doorway for a long time, long enough for Santini, who was behind him, to clear his throat twice, long enough for the particular quality of the silence in that room to become something Hargrove would remember for the rest of his life. Not as shame, not as anger, but as the first moment he understood that someone had been 3 moves ahead of him before he'd made his first one. He crossed to his credenza without being fully aware that he was moving. He looked at the chess set. Every piece was in its correct position. The board was perfectly arranged. The only absence was one rosewood queen, which was now on his desk, on top of an empty folder, in the center of a room where nobody had been. Santini's report, filed the following Tuesday, used the phrase "no indication of unauthorized access" 11 times. This was technically accurate. Every credential that had been used to access the 41st floor that night was a legitimate credential, properly issued and properly logged. Every person who had been on the floor was documented and accounted for. The cameras had recorded everything and revealed nothing that should not have been there. The report concluded that the incident represented a sophisticated and as yet unexplained breach of physical security and recommended a full operational review of vendor credentialing processes. Santini, who was good at his job and who had been doing it long enough to know what he didn't know, added a handwritten note at the bottom of his personal copy. Someone built this from the outside in. Started with the contract. He was right. He was also at that point about 6 weeks behind. Ray Okafor heard about it on a Wednesday, 3 weeks after it happened, from a former colleague named Terrell Brooks who still worked at the firm, and who called Ray from a blocked number at 7 in the evening, and spoke for 4 minutes and then hung up. Terrell didn't know what had been taken, or by whom, or what it meant. He knew that something had happened in Hargrove's office that nobody was allowed to talk about, that Hargrove had spent 10 days in what his assistant described as a controlled fury, and that the IT director had been let go. Ray listened to all of this from his kitchen in Flushing, where he had been sitting with a cup of tea and a spreadsheet he was building for a new client, a small family office in Astoria that was paying him $65 an hour as a consultant, which was not what he'd been making before, but it was work, and it was honest, and it was his. He did not know about the letter. He did not know about the chess piece. He did not know about Meridian Security Solutions or the 14 months of preparation that had preceded the Friday in question. What he knew was that something had shifted in some way he couldn't name, and that the shift had something to do with him. It was a feeling more than a knowledge, the kind of thing you don't mention to people because it sounds like the beginning of a story about someone who has started to believe they are more central to events than they are. 3 days after Terrell's call, a package arrived at Ray's apartment. Standard brown envelope, no return address, postmarked from Midtown Manhattan. Inside was a single sheet of paper. On it, in the same precise handwriting as the letter Hargrove had received 4 weeks earlier, were 11 document numbers. A numbering system Ray recognized immediately because he had devised it himself for the internal filing architecture he'd built when he joined Hargrove Capital 11 years ago. The note said, "These exist. They are in the right hands. You don't need to do anything." Ray read the note 4 times. He sat with it for a long time. Then he folded it carefully, put it in an envelope, and placed the envelope in the drawer of his desk, behind a copy of his daughter's first semester transcript from Stony Brook, where she was studying computer science, where the tuition was something he could almost manage, where she was doing, by every indication, extraordinarily well. He never heard from the gentleman directly. He never needed to. The 11 document numbers corresponded to files that a former Hargrove Capital paralegal named Isabel Reyes, no relation to the name on the Meridian contract, a coincidence that was either meaningless or a small private joke, and there was no way to know which, had spent 3 weeks organizing into a format suitable for submission to the New York State Department of Labor's Wage Enforcement Division, which had, as of the previous year, a new enforcement director who had been hired specifically to address systemic severance manipulation in the financial sector and who had, in her first 18 months, opened 14 investigations and extracted 11 settlements. The documents from Hargrove's file detailed a pattern, not just Ray's case, but 4 others, each restructured in the same window, each using the same buried clause, each signed under the same recommended counsel arrangement. Isabel had come to the documents the way most people come to the things that matter, through a side door. She had been working as a contract paralegal at a firm that occasionally did overflow work for Hargrove Capital's employment group, and she had been hired by that firm through a placement agency, and the placement agency had been contacted by someone she had spoken to for a total of 40 minutes across 2 phone calls, and who had described the role with a precision that, in retrospect, she understood to be something other than luck. She was good at her work. She had not been asked to do anything other than her work. The documents had come to her through a chain of steps that was, at every individual link, completely ordinary. A file request, a standard discovery production, a box of materials sent over by courier for review. The pattern only became visible when you held all 11 files at the same time and looked at the dates. Isabel held them at the same time. She looked at the dates. She understood what she was looking at. She knew what the Department of Labor Enforcement Director had been hired to find. She made a phone call. The investigation that followed took 7 months. It was not dramatic. Most consequential things are not dramatic. They are methodical, incremental, documented. The Department of Labor issued a finding. The finding was not criminal, but it was public, which for a man like Hargrove was considerably worse than criminal would have been. Criminal could be defended, could be contextualized, could be survived with enough legal talent and narrative management. Public findings of systematic wage manipulation in the financial press were a different category of problem. The Wall Street Journal ran a piece. Fortune ran a longer one. The Forbes profile from 4 years ago, the one with the Honest Broker headline, began to circulate on financial Twitter with a particular quality of ironic detachment that was, for anyone paying attention, its own form of verdict. Hargrove's attorneys negotiated a settlement. The amount was not disclosed publicly, but the terms required restitution to the 5 affected former employees. Ray Okafor received a certified check for $4,312,000. The original profit-sharing amount, plus interest calculated from the date the payment should have been made, plus a separate sum that the settlement documents described as supplemental compensation, and that Ray understood, without needing to be told, as an acknowledgement that what had happened had a name. He deposited the check on a Thursday. He called his daughter that evening. He didn't tell her the full amount, there was time for that, but he told her that things had changed, that she didn't need to worry about the spring tuition, that there was something he needed to explain to her eventually about how certain things work and who occasionally decides to make them work differently. She listened with the particular attention she brought to things she didn't fully understand yet, but intended to. She asked if he was okay. He said he was better than okay, which was true, and that he'd explain everything when she came home for break, which was also true, though he suspected his explanation would be incomplete, because there were parts of the story he didn't have, and parts he had decided not to look for. There are things you accept on terms that you can't fully audit. Ray Okafor was a quantitative analyst by training, a man who had built his career on the principle that if you had enough data, you could understand anything. He had learned at some cost that this was not entirely true. Some things you understand differently, not by seeing every variable, but by observing the outcome carefully and trusting that something with that particular shape had to have had a cause commensurate with it. He had received a note. The note had been right. Whatever had made it right was something he chose to leave in the category of things he was grateful for, without needing to explain. The gentleman who had followed the trajectory of the investigation from a sufficient distance to observe it without touching it, knew the settlement amount within 48 hours of the check being issued. He knew it through a channel that, like most of the channels he used, left no trace of itself after the information had passed through it. He sat with the number for a moment, then he moved on. He did not celebrate, which was not in his nature, and did not feel a particular resolution because resolution implies an end, and nothing he did had ends so much as completions, a point where the board had been reorganized into a configuration he had intended, and where the next game, whatever it would be, had not yet announced itself. He thought briefly about the chess set, about the note his own father had left him once in different handwriting and on different paper, about different things. A note he had read at a time when he had needed to understand that intelligence applied without code was just another form of the predation it resembled. He thought about what it had cost him to learn that, and about the fact that the learning had not cost him more than he could carry. He thought about Ray Okafor's daughter in Stony Brook, studying something rigorous and useful, building tools that would outlast the circumstances that had almost ended her father's capacity to support her being there. He thought about the particular satisfaction of a thing that had worked the way it was supposed to work, not the glamorous version, not the version with a face-to-face confrontation and a dramatic reversal, but the slow, documented, institutional version, where the evidence moved through the right channels and arrived at the right destination, and the outcome was not just symbolic, but actual. Charles Hargrove III kept the chess set. He had the queen that had been left on his desk placed back in its position on the board, which his assistant Patricia did one morning while he was in a meeting, following his instructions. He did not tell her why. She did not ask. But she noticed that he looked at the set differently after that. Not through it, the way he had for 22 years, but at it. With the attention of someone who has been reminded that an object he thought was decorative was actually a record of something. He never knew who sent the letter. He never knew who D. Reyes was, or how Meridian Security Solutions had been created, or how the credentialing chain had been built to withstand exactly the level of scrutiny his IT director had applied. He knew that someone had been inside his office, and that the inside of his office was a room where no unauthorized person had ever been, and that the line between authorized and unauthorized had been redrawn without his knowledge by someone who understood his systems better than he did. That understanding, not the settlement, not the press coverage, not the enforcement finding, but the specific private understanding that he had been outplanned, was the calling card. The chess piece was just the delivery mechanism. The note his father had written on the occasion of giving him the set said, "The game is won before the first move." Hargrove had read that sentence for 22 years as a description of his own approach. He read it differently now. He had not been wrong about what it meant. He had simply, for the first time in his professional life, encountered someone for whom it was also true. You stayed for this one, and this one earned your time. What happened on that floor is something you can turn over as many times as you want. You have most of the pieces. What you don't have, and what you're not going to get, is the final one. That's not withholding. That's respect. The gentleman doesn't explain the trick, and neither does this channel, because explaining it would convert something that happened into something that was merely described, and those are not the same thing. What this story is actually about, beneath the floor plan and the credential chain and the document numbers, is the difference between a warning and an invitation. Charles Hargrove received a letter that told him exactly what was going to happen. He read it as a challenge to be defeated. Every resource he deployed in response to that reading was a resource that had been anticipated. He built the mechanism of his own loss while believing he was building his defense. That is not stupidity. Hargrove was not stupid. It is something more interesting than stupidity. It is the specific blindness that comes from having won every game you've ever played inside a system you helped design. When someone operates outside that system, the instincts the system trained in you become liabilities. He trusted his perimeter. He trusted his credentials. He trusted that the people inside the perimeter were inside it for the reasons he understood. Every trust was correct about the wrong thing. The gentleman never lied to him. He told him what was going to happen. He told him in writing. He gave him 10 days. He let him build every wall. And then he walked through the door that the wall building had opened. If this episode found you at the right moment, share it. Not because the algorithm needs it, though it does, but because there's someone in your life who will hear this story and understand something about power and patience that they've been circling for a while without finding the right words for it. The gentleman's game is built for exactly that. Like, subscribe, and come back for the next one. Here is the question to sit with, and it is different from the one at the beginning. The letter told Hargrove the truth, completely and in advance, and he still lost. What does it take for a warning to actually land? And what has to be true about you? And about the person delivering it for you to hear it as a warning instead of a provocation?